What is God? In this video, I'm going to be talking about how humanity's perception of God has tremendously evolved and changed over time. And then I'm going to be talking about how my own personal beliefs and views about God have tremendously changed and evolved over time. And the way I understand God right now, today, looks absolutely nothing like the version of God that I grew up believing in. And so the reason I'm making this video is because I have learned that the word God can mean many different things to different people. And in my teachings and in my writings, I use this word God a lot. And so I want to be clear and I really want to specify what I am talking about when I use this word God, because I'm at a point now in my own spiritual journey where I'm discovering that the word God might not be the best word for me to continue to use when I'm referring to what I'm referring to. Because again, God, in the sense of the God I grew up believing, is completely different. And so to begin, I want to start off by talking about how this whole idea and concept of a God, of a higher power, of a greater source has been around for thousands of years. And if we go back to pre-modern times, during the ancient times, we find that the belief in a God or gods was something that was very common among almost every tribe in civilization. Now, these views of God may have looked different for each group, for each tribe, but essentially, God was everywhere. The belief in God was very common back then. And for some of these groups, some of these traditions, God was literally in everything. So God was in the wind, God was in fire, God was in water, God was in the land. God was all over the place. And then for some of these groups, God was this entity, this deity up there somewhere. And then it kind of turned into multiple gods. There were male gods and female gods, and we read a lot about this in ancient mythology. But essentially, during this time period of pre-modernism, God was everywhere. But then we go into modernism, modernity, and we find that God starts to fade away. Nietzsche writes, God is dead, and he's talking about this mythic version of God that we find in pre-modern times. And so during modernity, science is starting to come about, and these new ideas and philosophies and the enlightenment is starting to happen. And so God just kind of gets erased. God goes from being everywhere during the pre-modern times to essentially nowhere during modern times, modernity. But then we go from modernity to postmodernism, and in postmodernism, God starts to make a comeback. Except this version of God looks really nothing like the God that we read about in ancient times, in pre-modernism, the mythic, archaic version of God, this deity in the clouds or whatever it was. And so now we're starting to believe in God again, but God is not this deity. It's not this mega being in the clouds. It's consciousness, it's existence. It's not just a being, it is infinite being. God is something that transcends the conceptualization of the finite mind, and it's something that is experienced, something that is eternal and ineffable and infinite. And that's where we're starting to really move towards. And it's really fascinating to see that shift over time. And so for me, I grew up in a religion and in a tradition that really believed in this old archaic version of God. And this mainly came from the Bible, because in the Bible, especially really all throughout the Bible, but especially in the Old Testament, we read about a God who is up there somewhere, a deity, a super being who is up in the sky, up in the heavens, who is distant and separate from humanity. And when I read this as a kid and when I learned about this God in church, it was like this belief was ingrained into my subconscious mind. And so I was always thinking that there was the big man upstairs looking down upon me. And this came with a lot of fear. And I felt like this God was always judging me. So I was always trying to behave right. I was always trying to go to church and read my Bible and pray so that this God could be pleased. And then I thought that if this God was pleased, then this God would bless me and reward me. But then on the other hand, if I was not behaving right and I was not going to church and not praying, then I thought that this God was going to be upset and that this God would punish me. And so that was my view of God for most of my upbringing in church and religion. But then when I was in college, I had a spiritual awakening. And during the spiritual awakening, my whole perception of God shifted. God went from being a being in the clouds, a mega being, to being itself. God went from being a deity, an entity that existed, an object somewhere out there, to existence itself. And although the main writings that we read about in the Bible tend to portray God as a being, as some kind of male figure in the clouds with, white hair and a white beard, there are some verses, there are some times in the Bible that we read about this different perception of God. And so there really is no biblical version of God. There is no God of the Bible. We see different versions, different perceptions of God throughout the Bible because, as we know, the Bible was written over many years and it was written by many different authors with different beliefs who had different ideas, who came from different cultures and traditions. And so that had a big influence on how they perceived God or the divine. But there is one verse it's Acts 17, I believe, and this is Paul talking to the Athenians. And what he says is that in God we live and move and have our being. And I remember reading that during my spiritual awakening when I was starting to perceive God differently. And that really resonated with me because if God is something that is transcendent but infinite, then that implies that if God is infinite, God is boundless, God is limitless, which means that there is no place that God cannot be, including the depths of your being within us and within everything. And so my whole perception of God shifted to, again, not a being, but being itself, infinite being, the mystery of being. And it's something that we all share in collectively. And so the only reason that we have being is because we are sharing, we are participating in the one being. There is only one being, God's being. There is only one consciousness, God consciousness. There is only one existence, God's existence. It's all one. And this is what really the mystics and sages and saints and teachers from all these different spiritual traditions through the contemplative traditions have been saying for thousands of years. And now quantum physics is starting to say this, that separation is an illusion. Everything is one. Everything is interconnected. That is reality. That is what we are beginning to discover, and it's fascinating. And so Joseph Campbell, who was a writer, a teacher, and a professor, he taught a lot about mythology. He said this. He said, God is a thought, God is a name, God is an idea, but its reference is to something that transcends all thinking. The ultimate mystery of being is beyond all categories of thought. And so with that, it's okay to have these names and these concepts and these symbols and imagery and poetry and allegory to point to God, But ultimately, we must understand that those are all things that are pointing to God. They can never fully encompass or comprehend what God really is. And so even when I talk about now God being not just a being, but the ground of all being, that's allegory, that's poetic language, or the source of all life, or pure existence, pure consciousness, that which fills all things, that which gives us life and being and existence. Again, it's words that are trying to convey, trying to point to that which is, but ultimately all words, all names, all categories, all labels fall short. In Zen Buddhism, they say the finger pointing to the moon. And so all these different names and categories and labels and imagery and symbols and personifications are the finger that's pointing to the moon. But they are not the moon. They are not ultimate truth, ultimate reality. They're just things that are pointing to what is. And what the mystics have been saying for thousands of years from almost every religion is that God is something that is experienced, not something that can be thought intellectually. The presence of God, the essence of God, is something that we experience as divine union. We don't experience it as something external, as something separate from ourselves, as an object up there in the heavens. No, we experience it as one with our being. And so an analogy that I use often, and this is an analogy, it's not to be taken literally, is God is the ocean and we are each a unique wave of the ocean. We as a unique wave are not the ocean, but we all together collectively make up what the ocean is, and we are one with the ocean, and there is no separation. And that to me really describes or does a really good job at pointing to what God is and how we relate to God, how our being is one with God, and how there is only one being that everyone and everything takes part in, shares in collectively. And to me, that is a beautiful thing. There's a line in the Bible where God says, I am that I am. And I am can be synonymous with consciousness or awareness. It's that sense of presence, that sense of pure, infinite awareness. And that right there, I think, is the best way that we can even begin to describe and point to what God is. God is the consciousness. God is consciousness itself that is present in all things, in every one, and it's undivided. It is one. So it's not, we think that we are separate entities, separate egoic selves, but that's just an illusion of the mind. The truth is that we are all one, and that there is a sea of consciousness that we all share in, that we all live and move and have our being in. And that ultimately is what God is. And, even the word God is not, probably not the best word in this postmodern times to be using, because that word God has so much, I think, limitation and misunderstanding from the premodern version of God, the old archaic mythic version. And so I think consciousness and quantum physics and this whole notion of a unified field and oneness is a much better way to start explaining and articulating what we talk about when we are talking about God. That is what I'm talking about. That is what I have experienced, and that's where I am currently on my spiritual journey. And so I would love to hear what you think. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you currently understand and perceive this whole notion of God, and if your perception of God has changed over time, and where you think we are headed in terms of understanding God in the future and this whole process of God evolving. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you found it helpful and informative and insightful, please leave a thumbs up at the bottom of the screen and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.